Hey, everybody, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button.
All right, Chris Speaks back here today with Dr. Lucas Wilder, and we're going to continue on a little trend that we started last week or last month when we talked about the Gettysburg, Oklahoma, and Vicksburg campaign. So we're going to do another little comparison today and see how it goes. Lucas, how are you, my man?
I'm doing just fine. Fine as frog hair, split three ways.
I've never heard it split three ways. So before I tell the listeners what my theory I'm going to put forth. You never. I was the first person you ever heard this from, or correct?
Yeah, I've not heard it before. Doesn't mean it's original, but I hadn't
Right.
heard it before, and I really like the theory.
All right. So my hypothesis or theory is that the in the Eastern Theater, the Battle of Gettysburg was not the turning point of the Civil War. It was the Battle of the Wilderness. And first, let's look at a couple things here. Gettysburg and the Wilderness was separate things. When you look at how bad the Army of Northern Virginia got defeated, that was Lee's worst defeat. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that was his worst defeat on the battlefield. Absolutely.
Now, when you get in the wilderness, and I know there's been some revisionism on this, but tactically, that was a victory for Lee. Now, somebody would say strategically because Grant kept up, but in those days, for what was to be considered a victory was the army inflicted the most casualties, deprived their enemy of the objective, and commanded the field. And Lee did all three. So, do you think that's a fair statement? It was a tactical victory.
Yeah, I think I don't think many people would argue with you that it was a tactical victory.
Okay, so prior to when you look at the wilderness and look at what happened at Chancellorsville the year before, the same they were defeated, in my opinion, worse than what Hooker had been, or they'd received a more Thrasher whipping because Hooker could have weathered the storm. That's just my opinion on it. But every other commander would have moved back above the river and to refit and repair. And that would have given Lee one more chance to roll the dice and maneuver and go north one more time. And with a war-weary North who had suffered yet another horrendous defeat, which, as it was viewed at the time, in another offensive they was trying to mount, I think you can see the pressure starting to grow on the Lincoln administration, especially if they landed another victory up north. But maybe, it wasn't so much the battle, but those pivotal hours afterwards when Grant moves forward that made the Eastern Theater a game changer. That they were no longer going to be fought where Lee would be able to seize the initiative. Instead, he was being forced to fight on terms of not his choosing. Did I explain that well enough? Or
Yeah, you explained it good.
so what are your thoughts on that?
The Battle of the Wilderness, I've, like I said, hadn't heard this as an original statement, but I can see it being one of the turning points. Of course, my turning point is completely different than the Wilderness, and we could talk about that later. But for the Wilderness being the turning point, I can completely understand it being that. And it's not the battle itself that is the turning point. It is the moments after. This the few hours after when Grant decides that he's going to be disengaging and pulling back, pulling to the east, and then still heading south. That's the turning point because that revolutionizes and changes the entire landscape militarily of the Eastern Theater. Lee has been used to once you give a Union Army a thrashing, they pull back or even threaten to. But with Grant, he changes the game literally. And so that is the turning point that Lee no longer is able to maneuver the way he wants to. He has to follow Grant now and block his every movement. And there's a very important quote by Lee shortly after, I think it's shortly after the Battle of the Wilderness. Lee will say, "Gentlemen, we cannot win if we go into siege warfare." I'm summarizing, paraphrasing,
Did he
but
say we have to destroy this army before it gets across the James River, or in that?
that will come a little bit later.
Okay,
And
sorry.
yeah,
Sorry.
in this discussion, he's like he knows that if Grant's going to be pushing towards Richmond and it will settle into siege warfare, he cannot win. There's just no possible way. He's got to be able to move, and when that army is unable to move, then it will die. And so that's what his quote. Like I said, I'm paraphrasing the quote, but that adds credence to your theory that it is the turning point. And even though I don't agree with it being the turning point, I do absolutely agree that it's the turning point in the Eastern Theater.
Yes, that was what I meant, not the
Yeah.
overall. Sorry.
Mhm.
Do you think that after the 2 days of battle, when the armies were glaring at each other, that Lee thought Grant was going to pull back, and when he moved forward, it totally caught him off surprise?
I don't know. I can't read Lee's mind in that respect. I don't know if any Lee scholar might be able to illuminate his mindset when Grant um, doesn't move, it doesn't retreat. But I can definitely say Lee was very disappointed that he didn't, and he was again. Lee was a very smart man when it came to being able to read the other commander, and he did know that Grant was going to be different, but how different was yet to be seen. And so with Lee at that moment, I say he was hoping that Grant was going to pull back, but I don't think he truly believed he would. And this would be the moment that he was going to have to change his strategy too, which he does. He goes on and is able to move his army extremely fast to block Grant at Spotsylvania Courthouse, the North Anna River, and then going on down to Cold Harbor. And each time he is able to defend his location successfully, but he's taken horrible casualties as well. So is Grant, but Grant isn't stopping. That's the big difference. And that's what changes the entire concept of the war in the Eastern Theater is Grant just doesn't stop. And Lee is getting more and more worried as the days goes on and he's hoping that he can land a decisive strike. And he's just unable to do so. He gets really mad at the North Anna with AP Hill because AP Hill had an opportunity to actually destroy an entire corps, at least capture it or demoralize it horribly, bloody it enough that it's going to be unusable. And that was Warren's Fifth Corps. He had nearly the opportunity at North Anna, and Lee gets mad at him and says, why didn't you do what Jackson would have done and use your whole force to drive them into the river? And Lee gets extremely mad at AP Hill, and Hill just takes it in silence. But he's hoping to strike an important blow against Grant that he may turn back, and that's the same thing at the same time that the Atlanta campaign is going on, and Joseph E. Johnston is facing William T. Sherman in northern Georgia. He's waiting for the moment to strike. Of course, Johnston doesn't believe that can never find a perfect moment to strike, but he's hoping the same thing. If I can bloody him enough, maybe they'll turn back. And that's the hope. That's the hope. And so that's the hope of both Johnston and Lee as these two campaigns are going on, the Overland campaign in the East and the Atlanta campaign in the West.
Um, we'll talk about Lee. We said later when he's paraphrasing it, and I know this is probably a question you don't know, but do you think that maybe it dawned on him when he moved forward that this is different now? This is a game changer, or hadn't set in with him yet.
I think it did. From the Lee scholars that I have read, Lee knew when Grant came east that there was going to be a change in the Union Army. Now, what exactly that change was, how it was going to be prosecuted, well, of course, Lee didn't know. He's not a mind reader, but he definitely knew there was going to be a change. But how big of one and how long would it last? Again, he's hoping that he can land a decisive blow against Grant, bad enough that he'll pull back. The problem is Grant's not going to pull back, no matter which way he gets hit or how badly he gets hit.
I mean, because 1864, to me, and sometimes perception is not reality. I mean, maybe it was, because going into that year, the Confederacy did not perceive themselves as, well, they didn't perceive themselves as losing. If I don't know if that's a fair statement or not, but I think their morale was still pretty high.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely was high. Still very high in 1864.
So let me ask you this: when we're talking about this, had there been another commander in Meade State or whatever, and he took that beating and retreated back above the river, do you think Lee would have tried it one more time? I mean,
It's
because I base this too. I think we talked about this before. I believe that the whole reason Lee went north in 1863, he knew that the Confederacy was behind on the cards, and they needed to strike a decisive blow, on northern soil. And now it was even further going against him, and that he would have to do something now.
That's a hard one to. I don't think Lee had the capability of launching another such offensive
Based on
based on, and I could be wrong, because there are some scholars who believe he did have a growing amount of equipment and food and resources in order to launch another raid. I say a raid is kind of it's a large raid, but it technically was, especially the Gettysburg campaign, was almost as though it was just a large raid going into the north to get supplies, get horses, things of that nature. He needed more supplies to launch such an offensive. And one thing you'll see with my videos or any particularly is that when an army moves, it needs to have a stable base of operations and enough supplies to be able to launch these offensives. And Lee does very well to not have a constant stream of food and supplies. He takes a lot with him, and then he collects it as he's going. But that does make you susceptible to running out of food if you're not into the area that has a lot of forage for your men and horses to get a hold of. So I'm not sure. Like I said, could be wrong. I don't think he had the capability of launching such an invasion. Although one of the AP Hill scholars, which is Bud Robertson, seems to think that Lee's army was fairly strong at that in May of 1864 and could have. Again, there's some scholars that believe it. I personally don't. I'd really love to see the numbers on how his men and equipment and horses were actually holding up by 1864, but some scholars believe they were.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. In 2 or 3 months later in July, he was able to send a third of his forces with Early on his raid. So would he have not still been in better shape to do that in 1860 in May as opposed to then? Or could he even use a third of his army and did a raid like that as opposed to a full invasion?
That's an incredibly good point. The only thing I can counter with in that is that Early had a smaller force to be able to launch these raids, so he didn't need as much supplies in order to launch this raid. Could you take an entire army north? Plus, if you take an army north, will Grant actually move south?
Well, now I'm basing that on had another commander been in
Oh, okay.
charge.
Yeah.
And yeah, because I don't think that. Yeah, if Lee moved north, I think Grant would have just went straight, for the capital. Now here's another two, and I'm hypotheticals and go anywhere, but he's went into Maryland, he's went into Pennsylvania. Do you think he would try to go back to Pennsylvania or go back to Maryland, or what would be the objective then? Just to get on there and try to harass and cause more um what turmoil or this is what we're looking for with the northern populace?
Yeah, it's more psychological, I think. But Lee knew, just like Bragg knew when he invaded Kentucky, that Maryland wasn't supplying the troops and equipment and support that he thought they would. And so Maryland would be kind of, I won't say pointless, that Maryland's pointless, but Maryland wouldn't be the main objective. The wonderful orchards and fields in Pennsylvania would be much more of a lucrative thing for him to go after if he's needing supplies and needing that kind of equipment. But then I'll give you the other point. Joseph E. Johnston allegedly had a lot of foodstuffs coming into him by railroad and was expected to have launched an invasion of Tennessee during the early stages of the Atlanta campaign.
I didn't know that.
But he claimed he didn't have enough wagons, which could have been true. He might have had the supplies, but he didn't have the wagons in order to carry them, or the horses in order to carry them. And that could have been the same for Lee as well. He may have had the food, but did he have all the equipment and wagons in order to carry all that food with him? That's another thing. It's sometimes it's all about horses. And one thing I like to kind of think about is it was right before Fredericksburg, when Ambrose Burnside is waiting for his pontoon bridges to arrive. One reason they're so late, one of the many reasons that they're so late, is that they don't have the equipment to put horses to the wagons. Like the leather is not, the harnesses aren't made. And so they're having to bring them by water a lot of times, but they have to get them to the water. And so one reason they're so late is because they simply don't have the harnesses for the horses to pull the wagons that are pulling the pontoon bridges. So that's something else to factor in.
And another one too, I forgot to bring this up too, that I want to say turning points, and I don't know how much it would have factored in to it as well, but in the wilderness, General Longstreet was severely wounded, and that was his war horse. So now with A.P. Hill and General Ewell, I think he did a phenomenal job of still, commanding the army without him.
Yeah, of course, I think Longstreet is a little bit overblown with his abilities, but there's a lot to say about having someone that's experienced in that role. That you can't deny. And having someone experienced as a corps commander is very valuable to Lee. A.P. Hill is sick during parts of the Spotsylvania battle, but he does come back into the field. He's not 100%, but he does come back to command. Ewell's a fascinating character. Lee eventually loses faith in him during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, so he gets replaced pretty quickly after Spotsylvania, first with Early, and then eventually Early will take off into the Shenandoah Valley once they get to Richmond. But then Lee loses confidence in Early as well. So having that corps commander Longstreet gone is a problem with your foundation in your military machine.
And after that, I mean, when Grant came east in the northern the Overland campaign, Lee never got to maneuver again, correct?
Not on his own terms, unless you count Early's Valley campaign. Lee never got to maneuver on his own terms. He always had to move in order to block Grant in any situation.
And he was never able.
Yeah, he does a great job. he does a good job of blocking Grant, and he has a good strategy for it. Because after the Wilderness, if he makes it to Spotsylvania Courthouse first and is able to set up defenses there, holds out there until Grant pulls back again, and he's able to get one of the best races that they have is to the North Anna, and Lee beats
Oh, really?
Grant to the North Anna and sets up defenses on the other side of the river, which, and Grant comes across the river and gets defeated on that battlefield as well. So Lee does a wonderful job and is moving very, very quickly. But Grant's having to move a lot more men.
I thought, I always thought that his best race, and that's how I finished up the one of the final sentences in my paper on the wars, and the race was on the Spotsylvania Courthouse. Because I just thought, because I probably caught him off guard when he found out that he was moving forward, and and another thing too, I believe that from what I read is when the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac realized they were moving forward, they started cheering. So that was a huge morale booster for those men.
Oh yeah, when Grant starts moving south, there cheers go up from the army that they're actually moving. Now they've been in a pretty bloody battle, and they're pretty grumbled by that that they're having to move and continue to fight. But they are happy about moving south. The morale is wonderful for that moment. But one thing I think me and you've discussed, we may have discussed it last time, was that the war fundamentally changes after the Battle of the Wilderness. As you mentioned, you can see it as the turning point in the Eastern Theater. But for another reason as well, is because these soldiers have been used to fighting one battle maybe a month at the most. And then you go and do something, you go back into quarters, you move, you're not fighting the entire time.
Right.
That changes. You have the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse where it's constant fighting for days on end. The Battle of Wilderness happens just right before that. You got Spotsylvania Courthouse. A couple days later, you've got the North Anna. A couple days later, within a month span, you fought at least 4 major battles.
I didn't
And
do that
yeah,
one time.
yeah, within 1 month, you have fought 4 major battles and countless small engagements throughout the Central Virginia. Same thing goes for the Atlanta campaign. That changes as well. Depends on, let's look at the major battles the Army of Tennessee fought. You have Shiloh that happens in April. You've got Corinth that happens in the summer of 62. And then you don't have another one until you run into October when you have Perryville in Kentucky. Then a few months later, it's in late December, early January, you got Stones River. Then you don't have another major battle. You have a maneuver, the Tullahoma campaign, a few smaller battles, but then you don't have another battle for almost 9 months until you get to September with Chickamauga. And
Right.
then you have all these rapid battles in November when you have Grant pushing the Confederate Army out of Chattanooga. So it kind of follows Grant. You have all these mini battles when Grant's involved, but he changes that. Him and Sherman both. For Lee, let's look at the Army of Northern Virginia, what they did. Now 1862 is vastly different because there is a lot of campaigns, a lot of battles, but still they're about a month apart. Let's look at the Peninsula campaign. It runs into June, and then you've got the 7 days into July. Then you've got about a month and a half roughly. Of course, you got Cedar Mountain in mid-August. Then you got the Battle of Second Manassas that happens in late August. Then it's another month, not quite a month, but close to a month, in mid-September with the Battle of Antietam. Then you've got 2 months through October, November, finally December. You got Fredericksburg. Then you don't have another battle until May. So you've got about almost 6 months roughly until there. And then you got another month. You got Gettysburg in July. And then there's nothing else except for the Bristow Station campaign. So these battles happen quite a few months apart from one another. Now, again, within 1 month, you've got 4 major battles in the Eastern Theater, which is incredible. And it wears down soldiers on both sides. And that's one thing I was talking with another Civil War scholar just recently, and we were talking about that the difference between Lee and Grant and all the other commanders in the American Civil War in general, I don't, is that a battle when you're fighting it and men are attacking you. The big difference is if you will counterattack, because Lee and Grant knew that if you attack someone, you have wasted a lot of men, resources, and they're disorganized, and you can launch a successful counterattack. But many of these soldiers, they get attacked and then they hold back, and they're not able, and they won't go forward. But knowing that the enemy is just as badly, not maybe just as badly sometimes, but they're just as disorganized and depleted in ranks as you are in many cases. And if you will go on and you do a counterattack in some form or fashion, you will have a great advantage of winning. So that's a big difference in commanders. And you only see that with a few of them. Lee and Grant are the more prominent ones. But knowing that the enemy will be just as hurt in an attack or defense, mostly in the attack though, uh, so you can launch a counterattack is very valuable. And it seems kind of a no-brainer, but a lot of Civil War commanders never understood that. We see that with Rosecrans, and I'm actually a fan of Rosecrans. Not a huge fan, but a fan nonetheless. And at Stone's River, he doesn't launch a counterattack. At Corinth, he delays a counterattack when he, in both those situations, could have done dividends, earned dividends from launching these counterattacks and didn't. But that's the difference. It's a difference in Grant and Lee and the rest of these commanders in the Civil War. Both of them, those men knew that they could counterattack in many instances and gain an advantage in that counterattack.
Yeah, because I've read numbers about how many attacks were actually successful and how many weren't, and the effectiveness of a counterattack. You know, spoke volumes over the casualties they were receiving in the other ones. That's a good question I'm going to ask you about that. What was it? I can't remember now. Oh, I do this question. It's kind of, well, it's kind of related to it, but unrelated. How many people would they have on some type of burial detail without any casualty after a battle like that?
Good question. I don't know any specifics, but I do know that
Today, he got, say just 10,000 dead people. How many do you have to take to bury that?
yeah, I do know that a lot of times regiments and brigades would do their own burial of their own troops, especially if it was a defensive battle and they had the opportunity to. And that's the case. I'm adding the caveat here. If an army is stationary and they fought, the regiment, because you're going to be standing basically the same spot you were during the battle. So a regiment or a brigade or a division will detail a certain segment of their troops. So it won't be the entire regiment. It may be, if a regiment is 300 men, let's say, maybe 50 to 100 may go on burial detail. So to kind of think of it like that, you're detailing a section of a regiment, brigade, or division in order to do burial detail, and each, you know, if you're not on the same battlefield, that's even different. Like if you're not in the same position you were on a battlefield that you were when the battle took place, um, then it's going to be up to you burying people that you don't know. And that's when we get a lot of people, not all the time, because sometimes even if you are in the same location, you don't know the person that might be in your same regiment sometimes. But a lot of times we get those unknown soldiers. And sometimes it's because you just didn't know who they were because you're in a different part of the field and you're burying them. There's no way to know who they are.
Yeah, and I wonder too, because I was going back over some numbers of wars last night, and they've got deaths with the Confederacy listed as high as like 12,000 and as low as 7,400. Northerners as low as 1,700, and 22 or 23 for wounded and deaths. Like, how are your numbers so off? If you got had no how many people were in your units.
Numbers are off in as regard to what, like the
Well,
killed, the wounded, or
so I was looking at several of these things last night, and they had like I said, the Confederate casualties. They had numbers listed. Some of them they suffered from anywhere from 77 or 7,400 casualties. That's missing, wounded, and KIA together, upwards to 12,000. And the the Federals, had around 17,000 all the way up to 20-something thousand, 21. I think it really was. Man. God, how y'all get this? How y'all come up with this 4,000 people, 5,000 people?
well, there's a couple of ways you can do that. Do you remember which specific battle it was?
This was the wilderness.
The wilderness.
Yeah.
Most of the time we do know a general idea, but the reason some of them are so varied is because we don't have the most perfect records. Even the Union Army doesn't have perfect records. You're supposed to have form your men up and have a roll call about once a month and have that detailed. And you can find those service records in the National Archive. But what you have listed one month could change within the next month. Is the reason you lost this soldier between 1 month and this month the month previous, or let's say for the Battle of the Wilderness, you have your April roll call, and then by the time you get to May, you have the Battle of the Wilderness. What is, did soldiers leave? Did they desert? Did they desert and you just thought they were, obliterated during the battle, so they must be gone? So that's part of it. Another one is, because these battles are happening so quickly, are you able to have roll call? Are you able to document every single person that died in this battle as opposed to the Battle of the Spotsylvania Courthouse? So that's another factor you got to factor in with deciding on, did these soldiers die at Wilderness or at Spotsylvania? They happen so close together, and you may not have been able to have counted them up. Like, well, I think he died in this battle, but I don't think this gentleman did. Trying to rectify those numbers are pretty difficult to do. So that's one reason you have a disparity in numbers, and sometimes you don't keep any records at all. And so when we're looking at, particularly, I've noticed this with the Atlanta campaign, the Confederates are having a horrible time putting together their numbers of dead and wounded and all their losses, all their casualties. And so you're just having to give a good guess. Sometimes you're having to use the numbers that the Union had, which usually are a little bit high when they're talking about death for the enemy. And that goes for the Confederacy as well. I'm not just picking on the Union, but they usually exaggerate the numbers of dead and wounded for the enemy. So that's one reason you're going to have such a disparity in numbers. Today, we can somewhat do a little bit better detail because we're able to go into a bunch of different archives and find a whole lot of different sources that kind of verify which man died where. But even then, we're not completely knowledgeable about that.
Yeah, the fog of war thing, and that makes a lot tougher back then. I guess there's no way Jefferson perceived this. He told me some stories of him. He's totally out of touch with everything going on. So I think that's about all the questions I got for you on this. Is there anything else you think we should talk about or people share?
I don't think so. I think that kind of sums it up. But I like the theory and I could get on board with it, be it with the Battle of the Wilderness, or at least those few hours afterwards being the turning point in the Eastern Theater. That's when Lee has to kind of abandon his normal way of conducting warfare and has to change that in order to match what Grant's doing in Virginia.
Well, all right, man. I appreciate that. And I'll talk to you just a second when I cut off this, but I enjoyed it, and like always, let's do it again real soon.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate it.
Stop.